Jack Thompson's weathered hands trembled as he read the bank's ultimatum, tears blurring his vision. In that moment, he knew the fate of his family's century-old farm and the soul of Heartland itself now hung in the balance. The letter trembled in Jack Thompson's weathered hands, the crisp paper a stark contrast to his calloused skin. He read the words again, each one a hammer blow to his heart. The bank's ultimatum was clear: pay up or lose everything. 55 years of life, 3 generations of family history, and the economic linchpin of Heartland, Iowa, all balanced on the edge of a knife. Jack's eyes blurred with tears as he stumbled out of his study, the musty smell of old ledgers and faded photographs giving way to the warm, earthy scent of the kitchen. Sarah, his wife of 30 years, looked up from the sink, her hands still submerged in soapy water. One glance at his face told her everything. "Oh, Jack," she breathed, quickly drying her hands on a faded dish towel. "It's not good news, is it?" He shook his head, unable to form words. Sarah guided him to a chair at the worn kitchen table, its surface bearing the marks of countless family meals and late-night discussions. She poured him a cup of coffee, the rich aroma momentarily grounding him. "They're going to take it all, Sarah," Jack finally managed, his voice hoarse. "The farm, our home, everything." Sarah's face paled, but her voice remained steady. "We'll figure this out, Jack. We always do." Outside, the distant rumble of tractors in the fields mixed with the gentle rustle of corn stalks swaying in the breeze. The Thompson farm had stood as a pillar of Heartland for over a century, its success and struggles mirroring those of the community it helped sustain. As Jack sipped his coffee, trying to process the magnitude of their situation, a knock at the door startled them both. Sarah opened it to reveal Emily Chun, the town's newest resident and a journalist for the local paper. "M.R. and Mrs. Thompson?" Emily asked, her eager eyes taking in the scene before her. "I hope I'm not interrupting. I'm working on a piece about rural life and was hoping to interview you about the farm." Jack opened his mouth to decline, but Sarah jumped in. "Actually, Emily, your timing couldn't be better. Why don't you come in?" As Emily settled at the kitchen table, notebook in hand, Jack felt a mixture of reluctance and desperation. Maybe, just maybe, sharing their story could make a difference. "So, Mr. Thompson," Emily began, her pen poised, "can you tell me about the challenges facing farmers in Heartland today?" Jack took a deep breath, the weight of generations pressing down on him. "Well, Emily, it's not just about the weather or crop prices anymore. It's about survival. Small farms like ours are disappearing, swallowed up by big corporations or crushed by debt." As Jack spoke, his voice grew stronger, fueled by a lifetime of passion for the land and his community. He painted a vivid picture of Heartland's struggles, the exodus of young people to cities, the closure of local businesses, and the looming threat of foreclosure that hung over many farms. Emily listened intently, her pen flying across the page. "And your farm, Mr. Thompson? How has it managed to weather these storms?" Jack exchanged a look with Sarah, a silent conversation passing between them. "Finally," he said, "the truth is, Emily, we're facing our own storm right now. I just received a letter from the bank. They're threatening to foreclose on our farm." Emily's eyes widened. "Oh, Mr. Thompson, I'm so sorry. Is there anything that can be done?" "I don't know," Jack admitted, the reality of their situation hitting him anew. "This farm isn't just our livelihood. It's our heritage, our community's backbone. Losing it would be like losing a part of ourselves." As the interview continued, Jack found himself opening up more than he'd intended. He spoke of the farm's history, of the generations of Thompsons who had tilled this soil and built this community. He shared stories of drought years and bountiful harvests, of neighbors coming together in times of need. Emily's questions were thoughtful and probing, drawing out not just facts but emotions. Jack could see the story taking shape in her mind, and for the first time since reading the letter, he felt a glimmer of hope. As Emily prepared to leave, she paused at the door. "Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Thompson, thank you for sharing your story with me. I believe it's one that needs to be told. With your permission, I'd like to write a feature article about your situation and the broader issues facing Heartland." Jack hesitated, his natural reticence warring with the desperate need for help. Sarah squeezed his hand, offering silent support. "All right, Emily," he said finally. "If you think it'll make a difference, go ahead." As Emily's car disappeared down the dusty driveway, Jack and Sarah stood on the porch, the weight of their uncertain future pressing down on them. The sun was setting over the cornfields, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. It was a sight Jack had seen thousands of times, but tonight it felt different, a reminder of all they stood to lose. "What do we do now, Sarah?" Jack asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah leaned into him, her strength a counterpoint to his doubt. "We fight, Jack. We've never been quitters, and we're not about to start now. This farm, this community, they're worth fighting for." As darkness fell over Heartland, Jack Thompson stood on his porch, the letter from the bank still clutched in his hand. Tomorrow, he knew, the real battle would begin. But for now, surrounded by the land he loved and the woman who had stood by him through it all, Jack allowed himself a moment of peace. Whatever came next, they would face it together. As the first light of dawn crept over the horizon, Jack Thompson was already awake, his mind racing with the challenges that lay ahead. He moved quietly through the old farmhouse, careful not to wake Sarah. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet, each sound a reminder of the generations that had walked these halls before him. In the kitchen, Jack poured himself a cup of coffee, the aroma a comforting constant in a world that suddenly felt uncertain. He stepped out onto the back porch, inhaling deeply as he surveyed his land. The corn stood tall and proud, its leaves glistening with dew. In the distance, the old red barn, a Thompson family landmark for over a century, stood as a silent sentinel. As Jack sipped his coffee, memories washed over him. He remembered his grandfather, tough as nails but with hands gentle enough to cradle a newborn calf. He thought of his father, who had taught him every inch of this land, showing him how to read the soil and sky. And he recalled the day he had taken over the farm, full of youthful confidence and big dreams. The screen door creaked open behind him, and Sarah joined him on the porch. She wrapped her arms around his waist, resting her head on his shoulder. They stood in silence for a moment, drawing strength from each other. "I called Mike last night," Sarah said softly. "He's coming over this morning to talk about our options." Jack nodded, grateful for his wife's proactive approach. Mike Donovan, the manager of the local bank branch, had been a friend since childhood. If anyone could help them navigate this financial minefield, it was Mike. As if summoned by their thoughts, a cloud of dust appeared on the horizon. Mike's pickup truck came into view, bumping down the long driveway. Jack and Sarah walked out to meet him, exchanging worried glances. Mike stepped out of his truck, his usual cheerful demeanor subdued. "Jack, Sarah," he greeted them, his voice tight. "I came as soon as I could." They settled around the kitchen table, the same one where countless family discussions had taken place over the years. Mike spread out some papers, his face grim. "I'll be straight with you," he began. "The situation is tough. The bank's central office is putting pressure on all the local branches to improve their balance sheets. They're targeting farms like yours, land-rich but cash-poor." Jack leaned forward, his jaw set. "There must be something we can do, Mike. We've never missed a payment before this drought hit." Mike sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I've been fighting for you, Jack, but the higher-ups, they don't see the human side of things. They just see numbers on a spreadsheet." As Mike laid out their options, none of them good, Jack felt a familiar stubbornness rising within him. The same determination that had gotten the Thompsons through dust bowls and depressions, through wars and market crashes. "We're not giving up," Jack declared, his voice firm. "This farm isn't just a piece of land. It's the heart of this community." Sarah nodded in agreement, her hand finding Jack's under the table. "What if we organize some kind of community event?" she suggested. "A fundraiser to help us catch up on the payments." Mike looked thoughtful. "It could work. The amount you need to raise is substantial, but if we can show the bank that the community is behind you, it might buy us some time." As they discussed potential ideas, a knock at the door interrupted them. It was Emily Chun, the young journalist from the day before. Her eyes were bright with excitement. "MR and Mrs. Thompson, I'm so glad I caught you," she said breathlessly. I stayed up all night writing the article. It's going to be on the front page of today's paper. Jack invited her in, introducing her to Mike. As Emily laid out the newspaper on the table, they all leaned in to read. The headline jumped out at them. Heartland's Heart at Risk. Local farm fights for survival. Emily's article was powerful, weaving the Thompsons' personal story with the broader issues facing rural America. She had captured the essence of what the farm meant to the community and the devastating impact its loss would have on Heartland. As Jack read, he felt a mix of emotions, pride in his family's legacy, fear for the future, and a growing resolve to fight with everything he had. He looked up to see Sarah wiping away a tear, while Mike read with intense concentration. "This is exactly what we needed," Mike said finally. "It puts a human face on the situation. I can use this to argue your case with the higher-ups." Emily beamed, clearly proud of her work. "And that's not all," she added. "I've been getting calls all morning. People want to help. They're talking about organizing a town meeting to discuss ways to save the farm." For the first time since receiving the bank's letter, Jack felt a glimmer of real hope. He reached out and squeezed Emily's hand. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice thick with emotion. As Emily left to cover the growing community response, Mike stood to leave as well. "I'll do everything I can at the bank," he promised, "but start planning that fundraiser. We're gonna need every penny we can get." Left alone, Jack and Sarah sat in silence for a moment, processing the whirlwind of the morning. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice soft but determined. "We can do this, Jack. We're not alone in this fight." Jack nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. He stood and walked to the window, looking out over the fields that had been his family's lifeblood for generations. The morning sun had burned away the early mist, revealing the rich, fertile land stretching as far as the eye could see. In that moment, Jack made a silent vow. He would not be the Thompson who lost this farm. Whatever it took, he would find a way to save their land, their home, and their community's future. As if in response to his unspoken pledge, a warm breeze rustled through the cornfields, carrying with it the promise of a new day and the strength of generations past. Jack Thompson squared his shoulders and turned back to his wife, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The battle for Heartland's Heart had begun. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the Thompson farm, the quiet rural morning was shattered by the harsh ring of the telephone. Jack, who had been poring over financial documents at the kitchen table, jumped at the sound. Sarah answered, her face growing more concerned with each passing moment. "Jack," she said, covering the mouthpiece. "It's Hank from the co-op. He says there's an emergency meeting. Everyone's gathering at the community center." Jack's stomach tightened. In a small farming community like Heartland, an emergency meeting could only mean trouble. He nodded grimly, grabbing his worn denim jacket and keys. The drive into town was tense, the familiar landscape blurring past as Jack's mind raced with possibilities. Had another farm fallen victim to foreclosure? Was there a problem with the harvest? As they pulled up to the community center, the packed parking lot confirmed their fears. Whatever was happening, it was big. Inside, the air was thick with tension and the murmur of worried voices. Jack and Sarah squeezed into the crowded room, nodding to familiar faces. At the front, Hank Peterson, head of the local farming cooperative, stood with a grim expression. "Folks," Hank began, his voice cutting through the chatter, "I'm afraid I've got some bad news. Midwest AgriCorp has just announced they're closing down the grain elevator." A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by an explosion of voices. Jack felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. The grain elevator was the lifeblood of Heartland's agricultural economy. Without it, farmers would have to transport their crops much farther, eating into already thin profit margins. "That's not all," Hank continued, raising his hands for quiet. "They're also canceling all existing contracts for this year's harvest." The uproar that followed was deafening. Jack saw the fear and anger on the faces around him, faces of people he'd known his entire life. Beside him, Sarah gripped his hand tightly. As the initial shock wore off, people began shouting questions and suggestions. Some called for legal action, others for protests. Through it all, Jack remained silent, his mind working furiously. Finally, He stood up, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Folks, listen up." The room gradually quieted, all eyes turning to Jack. "This is bad, no doubt about it. But we've faced tough times before, and we've always come through by sticking together." He paused, looking around the room. "What if we formed our own co-op? Run the elevator ourselves?" A murmur ran through the crowd. Hank stepped forward, looking thoughtful. "It's not a bad idea, Jack, but where would we get the capital? The bank's not exactly being generous with loans these days." Jack felt the weight of the room's attention, the hope and skepticism mingling in the air. He took a deep breath. "I've got an idea about that too, but it's going to take all of us working together." Single quotes. For the next hour, the community center buzzed with intense discussion. Jack laid out his plan, a combination of community fundraising, pooled resources, and a proposal to turn the elevator into a community-owned enterprise. It was ambitious, perhaps even a little crazy, but as he spoke, he saw a spark of hope ignite in the eyes around him. As the meeting broke up, people clustered around Jack, offering support, suggestions, and, in some cases, hard-earned savings to kickstart the fund. The energy in the room had transformed from despair to cautious optimism. Amidst the crowd, Jack spotted Emily Chun furiously taking notes. She caught his eye and mouthed "incredible" with a thumbs up. He nodded back, grateful for her continued support. As they drove home, Sarah turned to Jack, her eyes shining with a mixture of pride and concern. "That was amazing, Jack, but can we really pull this off?" Jack gripped the steering wheel tightly. "We have to, Sarah. It's not just about our farm anymore. The whole town's counting on us." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Jack's dining room table became command central, covered in papers, financial projections, and lists of potential investors. The phone rang constantly with offers of help, questions, and occasionally doubts from those who thought the plan too risky. On the third day, as Jack was knee-deep in paperwork, Mike Donovan arrived unannounced. His face was grave as he settled into a chair across from Jack. "I've got news," Mike said, his voice low, "and I'm afraid it's not good." Jack felt his heart sink. "What is it, Mike?" Mike took a deep breath. "The bank's central office, they've decided to accelerate the foreclosure process. Not just on your farm, but on several others in the area." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. He struggled to find his voice. "How long?" 30 days, Mike replied, unable to meet Jack's eyes. "I'm so sorry, Jack. I fought as hard as I could, but..." Jack stood abruptly, needing to move, to do something. He paced the length of the kitchen, his mind racing. 30 days. It wasn't enough time. The co-op plan, the fundraising, it all needed more time. "There's more," Mike added hesitantly. Jack turned, bracing himself. "There's a group of investors from the city. They've expressed interest in buying up the foreclosed properties. They're talking about turning the whole area into some kind of agricultural theme park." The absurdity of it almost made Jack laugh. Almost. Instead, he felt a surge of anger unlike anything he'd experienced before. This wasn't just about his farm anymore. It was about the soul of Heartland itself. "No," Jack said, his voice quiet but filled with steel. "I won't let that happen. We won't let that happen." Mike looked at his old friend, seeing the determination in his eyes. "What are you going to do, Jack?" Jack was silent for a moment, staring out the window at the land that had been in his family for generations. When he turned back, there was a fire in his eyes. "We're going to fight, Mike. We're going to save this farm, save this town, and show those city investors what real community looks like." As Mike left, promising to do what he could from his end, Jack sank into a chair, the weight of the challenge ahead settling on his shoulders. Sarah found him there moments later, took one look at his face, and knew something had changed. "What is it, Jack?" she asked softly. He looked up at her, the woman who had stood by his side through every trial and triumph. "It's time, Sarah. Time to call in every favor, every resource we've got. We're not just fighting for our farm anymore. We're fighting for Heartland's soul." Sarah nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. "I'll start making calls. We'll need everyone for this." As the sun set over the Thompson farm, casting long shadows across the fields, Jack stood on his porch, looking out over the land he loved. The challenge ahead was daunting, perhaps the greatest he'd ever faced. But as he watched the golden light play across the cornfields, he felt a surge of determination. This land, this community, was worth every ounce of fight he had in him. And Jack Thompson was ready for the battle of his life. The next morning dawned with a sense of urgency that seemed to electrify the air. Jack was up before the sun, his mind already racing with plans and possibilities. As he stood in the kitchen, clutching his coffee mug like a lifeline, Sarah joined him, her face etched with determination. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice steady despite the worry in her eyes. "We need to call a town meeting tonight. If we're going to save Heartland, we need everyone on board." Jack nodded, feeling a surge of gratitude for his wife's strength. "You're right. I'll start making calls." The day passed in a whirlwind of activity. Word spread quickly through Heartland's grapevine, and by mid-afternoon, it seemed the entire town was buzzing with anticipation. Jack spent hours on the phone, rallying support, answering questions, and trying to quell the fear that threatened to overwhelm him. As evening approached, Jack and Sarah made their way to the high school gymnasium, where the meeting was to be held. The parking lot was already full, and as they walked in, Jack felt a mix of hope and trepidation at the sight of so many familiar faces. The gymnasium hummed with nervous energy as people filed in, filling the bleachers and spilling onto the floor. Jack saw farmers in dusty work boots sitting next to shopkeepers in pressed shirts, teenagers with worried expressions next to elderly couples clutching each other's hands. This was Heartland in all its diversity and unity. As Jack made his way to the front, he caught sight of Emily Chun, notepad in hand, talking animatedly with a group of young farmers. She gave him an encouraging nod as he passed. Taking a deep breath, Jack stepped up to the microphone. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. "Friends, neighbors," he began, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "I know you've all heard about the trouble we're facing. The bank's accelerated foreclosure, the grain elevator closing, the threat of outside investors. It might seem like too much to handle." He paused, looking out over the sea of faces. "But I'm here to tell you that it's not. We are Heartland. We've weathered droughts and floods, market crashes and personal tragedies. And we've always come through stronger." As Jack laid out the situation and his ideas for saving the community, he could see the mood in the room shifting. Fear and resignation gave way to determination and hope. "It won't be easy," Jack continued. "We'll need every one of us to contribute what we can. Time, money, skills. But I believe that together, we can not only save our farms and our town, but build something even stronger for the future." As he finished speaking, the gymnasium erupted in applause. People stood, cheering and calling out offers of support. Jack felt a lump form in his throat at the outpouring of community spirit. But the real work was just beginning. Over the next few hours, committees were formed, plans were made, and a spirit of collective purpose filled the air. The idea of a community-owned cooperative to run the grain elevator gained traction, with local business owners offering expertise and resources. As the meeting wound down, Jack found himself surrounded by neighbors offering handshakes, words of encouragement, and promises of support. Among them was old Tom Wilson, the town's eldest resident and a living repository of local history. "Jack," Tom said, his voice quavering with age but filled with conviction, "what you're doing here, it reminds me of the old days. When a barn burned down, the whole town would come together to rebuild it. That's the spirit of Heartland, and you've brought it back to life." Jack felt a wave of emotion wash over him at the old man's words. He squeezed Tom's shoulder, unable to speak for a moment. As the crowd thinned, Mike Donovan approached, his face a mix of admiration and concern. "That was something else, Jack," he said. "But you know the bank won't make this easy. They've got their eyes on the bottom line, not community spirit." Jack nodded grimly. "I know, Mike, but we've got something they don't. Hearts and souls invested in this land. We'll find a way." As they left the gymnasium, the cool night air felt charged with possibility. Sarah slipped her hand into Jack's, and they walked in companionable silence to their truck. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. The Thompson farm became the unofficial headquarters of the Save Heartland campaign. The dining room table disappeared under maps, financial projections, and legal documents. The phone rang constantly with updates, questions, and offers of help. Jack found himself working from dawn till well past dusk. His days a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and hands-on farm work. The strain was beginning to show. Dark circles under his eyes, a persistent ache in his back. But he pushed through, driven by the knowledge that the future of Heartland rested on their success. One evening, as Jack pored over yet another set of financial projections, Sarah gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "Jack," she said softly, "you need to take a break. You're running yourself into the ground." He looked up, ready to protest, but the concern in her eyes stopped him. "You're right," he admitted, rubbing his tired eyes. There's so much at stake, Sarah. If we fail, we won't," she said firmly. "Come on, let's take a walk. The fresh air will do you good." As they strolled hand in hand through the fields, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, Jack felt some of the tension leave his body. The land around them seemed to pulse with life, the rustle of corn in the breeze, the distant lowing of cattle, the chirp of crickets beginning their nightly chorus. "You remember our first harvest?" Sarah asked, a wistful smile on her face. "How proud your father was, watching you take charge." Jack nodded, the memory vivid in his mind. "He told me that day that being a farmer wasn't just about growing crops. It was about nurturing the land, the community, about leaving things better than you found them." They stopped at the crest of a small hill, looking out over the patchwork of fields stretching to the horizon. In the distance, the lights of Heartland were beginning to twinkle in the gathering dusk. "We're doing that now, Jack," Sarah said softly. "Whatever happens, we're fighting for something bigger than ourselves. And that's what your father, what all the Thompsons before us, would have wanted." Jack pulled Sarah close, feeling a renewed sense of purpose wash over him. She was right, of course. This wasn't just about saving a farm or even a town. It was about preserving a way of life, a connection to the land and to each other that was becoming all too rare in the modern world. As they turned back toward the house, Jack's mind was already racing with new ideas, new approaches to their challenge. But now, alongside the urgency and the worry, there was something else, a deep, abiding sense of rightness in what they were doing. The battle for Heartland was far from over, but in that moment, standing on his land with the woman he loved, Jack Thompson felt ready to face whatever came next. The spirit of generations of farmers, of community members who had faced adversity and triumphed, seemed to flow through him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new obstacles to overcome. But tonight, under the vast prairie sky, Jack allowed himself to hope. Heartland had faced dark times before and emerged stronger. But the community united behind them, they would do so again. As they reached the porch, the old wooden steps creaking beneath their feet, Jack paused for a moment, looking back over the darkening fields. In the distance, a coyote called, a lonely sound that echoed across the prairie. But to Jack, it sounded like a rallying cry, a reminder of the wild, enduring spirit of the land they were fighting to preserve. With renewed determination, he stepped into the house, ready to continue the fight for Heartland's future. As the Save Heartland campaign gained momentum, Jack found himself at the center of a whirlwind of activity. The community's response had been overwhelming, with people from all walks of life stepping up to offer their skills, resources, and time. But with each passing day, the looming deadline set by the bank cast a long shadow over their efforts. One crisp morning, as Jack was checking the irrigation system in the far field, he spotted an unfamiliar car kicking up dust on the long driveway to the farmhouse. Wiping his brow, he made his way back, curiosity and apprehension mingling in his gut. As he approached, a man in an expensive suit stepped out of the car, looking comically out of place among the farm equipment and weathered buildings. Jack's eyes narrowed as he recognized the man from news reports, Robert Caldwell, CEO of AgriCorp, the company behind the grain elevator closure. "Mr. Thompson," Caldwell called out, extending his hand. "Robert Caldwell, I hope you don't mind me dropping by unannounced." Jack hesitated for a moment before shaking the offered hand. "What can I do for you, Mr. Caldwell?" Caldwell's smile was practiced, but it didn't reach his eyes. I've been hearing a lot about your community's efforts. I must say, it's admirable. But I wanted to talk to you personally about a proposition that could benefit everyone involved. Jack's jaw tightened, but he nodded. Why don't we step inside? In the kitchen, Sarah's eyes widened as she saw their visitor, but she quickly composed herself, offering coffee with practiced hospitality. As they settled around the old oak table, Jack couldn't help but notice how out of place Caldwell looked in their modest farmhouse. "Mr. Thompson," Caldwell began, his voice smooth as oil. "I'll cut to the chase. Agricorp is prepared to offer you a very generous payout for your farm, more than fair market value. This offer extends to several other key properties in the area as well." Jack felt his pulse quicken, anger and disbelief warring within him. "And what exactly does Agricorp plan to do with our land?" Caldwell leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with enthusiasm that Jack found unsettling. "We have a vision, Mr. Thompson. An agricultural theme park that will bring tourism and jobs to the area. Think of it, visitors from all over the country coming to experience the Heartland experience. Your farm would be at the center of it all." The silence that followed was deafening. Jack could feel Sarah's eyes on him, could sense her tension matching his own. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and controlled. "Mr. Caldwell, this land has been in my family for generations. It's not just property to us. It's our heritage, our way of life, and it's the same for many families in Heartland." Caldwell's smile never wavered. "I understand sentiment, Mr. Thompson, but think of the bigger picture. The agricultural industry is changing. Small farms like yours are becoming unsustainable. Our plan could bring economic revival to this entire region." Jack stood up abruptly, unable to contain his emotions any longer. "Economic revival? By turning our homes into some kind of theme park attraction? This isn't just about money, Mr. Caldwell. It's about community, about a connection to the land that goes bone deep." Caldwell's facade cracked slightly, a flicker of frustration crossing his face. "Mr. Thompson, I urge you to think practically. The bank's deadline is approaching. Our offer might be your best option to avoid foreclosure." "Thank you for your time, Mr. Caldwell," Jack said firmly, moving towards the door. "But we're not interested. We have our own plans for Heartland's future." As Caldwell's car disappeared down the driveway, Sarah wrapped her arms around Jack. "You did the right thing," she murmured. Jack nodded, but his mind was racing. Caldwell's visit had made the threat they were facing all too real. They needed to accelerate their plans, and fast. The next few days were a flurry of activity. Jack called an emergency meeting of the campaign's core team. In the crowded back room of Mabel's diner, he laid out what had happened. "Caldwell's visit means we're on the right track," he concluded. "They're worried about what we're doing, but it also means we need to move faster." Emily Chun, who had become an integral part of the team, spoke up. "I've been doing some digging," she said, her eyes bright with excitement. "There's a state-level grant for rural community development. If we can put together a solid proposal for our cooperative, we might have a shot at it." A buzz of excitement filled the room. Mike Donovan, who had been quietly supportive despite his position at the bank, leaned forward. "That could be the financial boost we need, but the application process is complex, and time is short. We'll make it work," Jack said firmly. "Emily, can you take the lead on the grant proposal?" "Mike, we'll need your financial expertise." As the meeting broke up, people hurrying off to their assigned tasks, Jack felt a renewed sense of hope. But he knew the hardest part was yet to come. The next weeks were a blur of long days and longer nights. Jack found himself juggling farm work with endless meetings, phone calls, and strategy sessions. The strain was beginning to show on everyone, but the sense of purpose that had taken hold of the community seemed to push them forward. One evening, as Jack was struggling with yet another revision of their business plan, Sarah came into the study, a concerned look on her face. "Jack, there's something you need to see," she said, handing him a letter. As he read, Jack felt his heart sink. It was from his doctor, reminding him of an overdue follow-up appointment for some tests he'd had done months ago, before all this started. Sarah sat beside him, taking his hand. "You've been pushing yourself too hard. You need to take care of yourself, Jack. Heartland needs you healthy." Jack nodded, suddenly feeling every one of his years. "You're right. I'll call in the morning." set up an appointment. But as he lay in bed that night, sleep eluding him, Jack couldn't shake the nagging worry. What if there was something seriously wrong? What would happen to the farm, to their plans for Heartland, if he couldn't see this through? The next morning, as Jack went through his daily routine of farm chores, each familiar task seemed to take on new significance. The weight of the cattle prod in his hand, the smell of fresh hay, the distant moo of the cows, all of it felt precious, fragile. As he walked back to the house, the sun rising over the fields he'd known all his life, Jack made a silent promise. Whatever happened, he would see this fight through. Heartland deserved nothing less. Inside, he found Sarah on the phone, her face animated as she talked. As she hung up, she turned to him with a smile that lit up her entire face. "That was Emily," she said, excitement bubbling in her voice. "Jack, we got the grant. The state approved our proposal for the cooperative." For a moment, Jack stood stunned, the news washing over him. Then, with a whoop of joy, he swept Sarah into his arms, spinning her around the kitchen. As they celebrated, Jack felt a weight lift from his shoulders. They still had a long way to go, but this was a crucial victory. With the grant money, they could move forward with their plans for the community-owned grain elevator, providing a lifeline for local farmers. Later that day, as word spread through Heartland, a spontaneous celebration erupted in the town square. Jack found himself surrounded by friends and neighbors, all offering congratulations and renewed pledges of support. In the midst of the festivities, Jack caught sight of Mike Donovan standing at the edge of the crowd, a conflicted look on his face. Making his way over, Jack clapped his old friend on the shoulder. "We couldn't have done this without you, Mike," he said softly. Mike met his eyes, a mix of emotions playing across his face. "Jack, there's something you should know. The bank, they're not happy about this grant. There's talk of legal challenges, of finding ways to block the cooperative." Jack felt a chill run down his spine, but he forced a smile. "Then we'll face that when it comes. Together." As the sun set on Heartland that evening, painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and purple, Jack stood on his porch, looking out over the town. The sounds of celebration still echoed in the distance, a testament to the resilience and spirit of this community he loved so dearly. They had won a battle today, but Jack knew the war was far from over. The bank, AgriCorp, the changing face of agriculture, all these forces were still arrayed against them. And his own health remained a question mark, a shadow at the edge of his thoughts. But as he watched the lights come on in homes across Heartland, Jack felt a surge of determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced every other obstacle, together, with the strength of a community united in purpose. The fight for Heartland's soul was far from over, but tonight, under the vast prairie sky, hope burned brighter than ever. As the initial euphoria of winning the state grant began to settle, the real work of implementing their ambitious plans for Heartland's future kicked into high gear. Jack found himself at the center of a whirlwind of activity, juggling the demands of running his farm with the countless meetings, phone calls, and decisions required to bring their community cooperative to life. The old grain elevator, once a symbol of Heartland's decline, now buzzed with activity. Volunteers worked tirelessly to refurbish the structure, transforming it into the heart of their new cooperative venture. Jack often found himself there at odd hours, lending a hand wherever needed, his weathered hands equally at home with a wrench or a paintbrush as they were with a plow. One sweltering afternoon, as Jack was helping to install new grain conveyors, he spotted a familiar figure making her way across the lot. Emily Chun, notepad in hand, picked her way carefully through the construction debris. "Emily," Jack called out, climbing down from his perch. "What brings you out here?" The young journalist's face was alight with excitement. "Jack, I've got some news. Remember those investors Caldwell mentioned? The ones interested in turning Heartland into a theme park? I've been doing some digging, and I think I've uncovered something big." Jack's interest was piqued. "What have you found?" Emily glanced around, then lowered her voice. "I can't say too much yet. I need to confirm a few things. But if I'm right, AgriCorp's plans for Heartland go way beyond a simple theme park. There might be some serious environmental concerns involved." Jack felt a chill despite the summer heat. How soon can you know for sure? Give me a couple of days, Emily replied. I'm meeting a source tomorrow who might have some insider documents. As Emily hurried off, her phone already to her ear, Jack leaned against a stack of lumber, his mind racing. If Emily's suspicions were correct, it could change everything. But it also meant that the forces aligned against them were even more formidable than they'd realized. That evening, as Jack shared Emily's news with Sarah over dinner, he couldn't shake a sense of unease. If AgriCorp is willing to go to these lengths, he mused, pushing his food around his plate, who knows what else they might do to stop us. Sarah reached across the table, squeezing his hand. We've come too far to back down now, Jack. Whatever they throw at us, we'll face it together. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Jack threw himself into work, splitting his time between the farm and the cooperative project, trying to push aside his worries about Emily's investigation and his own looming medical appointment. It was nearly midnight when the phone rang, startling Jack from a fitful sleep. Sarah stirred beside him as he fumbled for the receiver. Jack, it's Emily. I'm sorry to call so late, but you need to hear this. Fully awake now, Jack listened intently as Emily laid out what she'd discovered. AgriCorp's plans were indeed more extensive than they'd let on. The company was eyeing the aquifer beneath Heartland, with intentions to exploit it for water-intensive industrial agriculture and potentially harmful fracking operations. This isn't just about preserving our way of life anymore, Jack, Emily concluded, her voice tight with urgency. It's about protecting the land itself. After hanging up, Jack sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. Sarah, now fully awake, rubbed his back gently. What is it? She asked softly. As Jack relayed Emily's findings, he could see the same mix of anger and determination he felt reflected in Sarah's eyes. We need to call an emergency meeting, she said firmly. First thing in the morning. The whole town needs to know what we're really up against. The next day dawned bright and clear, but there was a tension in the air as people gathered in the high school gymnasium. News of the emergency meeting had spread quickly, and it seemed the entire town had turned out. Jack stood at the podium, looking out over the sea of familiar faces. Friends, neighbors, people he'd known his entire life, all looking to him for answers, for hope. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he had to say. Friends, he began, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his gut. I wish I had better news to share. But the truth is, we're facing a bigger fight than we realized. As Jack laid out what Emily had uncovered, a palpable wave of shock and anger swept through the room. People began calling out questions, their voices rising in a cacophony of concern and outrage. What about our water? They can just come in and destroy our land. How do we stop them? Jack raised his hands, calling for calm. I know this is a lot to take in, but we can't let fear or anger cloud our judgment. We need to approach this smartly, strategically. Over the next hour, a plan began to take shape. They would need legal help to challenge AgriCorp's plans, environmental studies to document the potential impact, a media campaign to bring national attention to their plight. As the meeting wound down, Jack felt a mix of exhaustion and resolve. The path ahead was even more daunting than before, but looking around at the determined faces of his neighbors, he knew they were up for the challenge. As people filed out of the gym, Jack felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to find Mike Donovan, his face grave. Jack, we need to talk, Mike said quietly. Not here. Can you meet me at the bank after hours? The seriousness in Mike's tone sent a shiver down Jack's spine. He nodded, wondering what new challenge they were about to face. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jack made his way to the bank. The streets of Heartland were quiet. Most people home for dinner were still discussing the revelations of the day's meeting. Mike was waiting outside, keys in hand. He ushered Jack in quickly, locking the door behind them. In the dimly lit interior of the bank, Mike's face looked haggard, lined with worry. Jack, I'm risking my job by telling you this, Mike began, his voice barely above a whisper, but you need to know. The bank's central office, they're not just passively supporting AgriCorp. They're actively involved in this plan. Jack felt as if the floor had dropped out from under him. What are you saying, Mike? Mike ran a hand through his thinning hair. The foreclosures, the pressure on local farmers. It's all part of a coordinated effort to clear the way for AgriCorp's project. The bank stands to make a fortune if this goes through. For a moment, Jack couldn't speak. The magnitude of what they were up against threatened to overwhelm him. "Why are you telling me this, Mike?" he finally managed. Mike met his eyes, a mixture of shame and determination in his gaze. "Because it's wrong, Jack. What they're doing. It's not just business. It's destroying lives, destroying the land. I can't be a part of it anymore." As Jack left the bank, his mind reeling from Mike's revelations, he paused on the sidewalk, looking up at the star-filled sky. The same stars his grandfather had gazed upon, and his grandfather before him. Stars that had watched over generations of farmers tending this land. In that moment, Jack felt the weight of history on his shoulders. But along with it came a surge of resolve. This land, this community, had faced challenges before. They had endured droughts and floods, economic downturns and personal tragedies. And they had always come through, stronger for the struggle. As he walked home through the quiet streets of Heartland, Jack's mind was already racing with plans. They would need to move quickly, to marshal every resource at their disposal. The fight ahead would be hard, perhaps the hardest they'd ever faced. But looking around at the town he loved, at the fields stretching out to the horizon, Jack knew it was a fight worth having. For the land, for the community, for the future of Heartland itself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles to face. But tonight, under the vast prairie sky, Jack Thompson felt ready for whatever lay ahead. The spirit of generations of farmers, of community members who had faced adversity and triumphed, seemed to flow through him. Heartland's soul was at stake, and Jack was determined to see this fight through to the end, no matter the cost. As dawn broke over Heartland the next morning, Jack was already wide awake, his mind churning with the weight of Mike's revelations, the enormity of what they were up against. Not just AgriCorp, but the bank itself threatened to overwhelm him. But as he stepped out onto the porch, the familiar sight of his field stretching to the horizon steeled his resolve. Sarah found him there, staring out at the land, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands. She didn't say a word, just stood beside him, her presence a comforting anchor in the storm of his thoughts. "We need to call the team together," Jack said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Today, we need a new strategy." Within hours, the core group of the Save Heartland campaign was gathered in the Thompsons' living room. Emily Chun, notepad at the ready, Hank Peterson from the co-op, Lisa Martinez, a local environmental lawyer who'd volunteered her services, and Mike Donovan, looking uncomfortable but determined. As Jack laid out what Mike had told him, a heavy silence fell over the room. It was Lisa who finally broke it, her voice tight with controlled anger. "This is bigger than we thought," she said, leaning forward, "but it also gives us leverage. If we can prove collusion between the bank and AgriCorp, we might have a case for illegal practices." Emily's eyes lit up. "I can start digging into the connections between the bank's board and AgriCorp. There might be a paper trail we can follow." As they discussed strategy, a plan began to take shape. They would need to move on multiple fronts: legal action, media exposure, grassroots organizing, and political pressure. "We need to think bigger," Hank said, his weathered face creased with determination. "This isn't just about Heartland anymore. If we can expose what's happening here, we might be able to help other communities facing similar threats." Jack nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. "You're right. We need to reach out, build alliances. There must be other towns, other farmers facing the same pressures." As the meeting wound down, each person left with a list of tasks and a renewed sense of purpose. But as the door closed behind the last of them, Jack sank into his armchair, suddenly feeling every one of his years. Sarah sat on the arm of the chair, running her fingers through his graying hair. "You need to rest, Jack. You can't keep pushing yourself like this." He looked up at her, seeing the worry in her eyes. "I know, but there's so much to do, and time's running out, which is exactly why you need to take care of yourself," she said firmly. "Don't forget, you have that doctor's appointment tomorrow." Jack had almost forgotten about the follow-up appointment for his tests. The reminder sent a jolt of anxiety through him. With everything happening, he couldn't afford to be sidelined now. The next morning, As Jack sat in the sterile examining room, the smell of disinfectant sharp in his nostrils. He tried to push away thoughts of the farm, of AgriCorp, of the monumental task ahead. But as Dr. Anderson entered, a serious look on her face, Jack felt his heart sink. "Mr. Thompson," she began, her voice gentle but professional, "I'm afraid the test showed some concerning results. We've detected early signs of heart disease." The doctor's words seemed to come from far away as she explained the diagnosis, the recommended treatments, the lifestyle changes he'd need to make. Jack nodded mechanically, his mind reeling. As he left the clinic, prescription in hand and follow-up appointments scheduled, Jack felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. He'd always prided himself on his strength, his ability to outwork any problem. Now, his own body was betraying him. He drove home in a daze, the familiar landscape blurring past his windows. As he pulled up to the farmhouse, he saw Sarah waiting on the porch, her face etched with concern. One look at his expression told her everything she needed to know. Without a word, she enveloped him in a tight embrace. For a long moment, they stood there, drawing strength from each other. Finally, Jack pulled back, meeting Sarah's eyes. "I can't stop now," he said, his voice hoarse. "There's too much at stake." Sarah cupped his face in her hands. "We'll face this together, Jack, just like we faced everything else. But you have to promise me you'll take care of yourself. Heartland needs you. I need you." Jack nodded, feeling a lump in his throat. As they went inside, he knew he'd have to find a way to balance his health with the fight ahead. But for now, he allowed himself to lean on Sarah's strength, grateful for her unwavering support. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. Jack, heeding Sarah's and Dr. Anderson's warnings, delegated more responsibilities to the team. He focused on coordinating their efforts, using his deep knowledge of the community and the land to guide their strategy. Emily's investigative work began to bear fruit. She uncovered a web of connections between AgriCorp executives and members of the bank's board, hinting at a long-standing relationship that went far beyond normal business dealings. Lisa worked tirelessly, preparing legal challenges and building a case against both AgriCorp and the bank. Her small office became a hub of activity, filled with stacks of documents and the constant hum of phone calls. Hank led the effort to reach out to other communities facing similar threats. Soon, they were in contact with farmers and activists across the state, sharing information and strategies. Through it all, Jack felt the constant pressure of time. The bank's deadline loomed ever closer, and each day brought new challenges. But he also saw something remarkable happening in Heartland. People who had never been involved in community affairs were stepping up, offering their skills and resources. The town was coming alive with a sense of shared purpose. One evening, as Jack sat on his porch watching the sun set over his fields, he heard the crunch of gravel in the driveway. To his surprise, he saw Robert Caldwell's sleek car pulling up. The AgriCorp CEO stepped out, looking less polished than in their previous encounter. His face was drawn, his suit slightly rumpled. "Mr. Thompson," Caldwell called out, approaching the porch. "I was hoping we could talk." Jack studied the man for a moment, then nodded, gesturing to the chair beside him. Caldwell sat, looking uncomfortable. "I'll be frank, Mr. Thompson," he began. "Your campaign is causing us difficulties. The media attention, the legal challenges. It's making our investors nervous." Jack remained silent, waiting for Caldwell to continue. "I'm here to offer you a deal," Caldwell said, his voice low. "AgriCorp is prepared to make a very generous offer, not just for your farm, but to set up a fund for community development. In return, we ask that you end your campaign and support our project publicly." For a moment, Jack was tempted. The amount Caldwell was offering could solve so many problems, could secure a comfortable future for his family and help many in the community. But then he thought of the land stretching out before him, of the generations who had worked it, of the community that had come together to fight for its future. He thought of the aquifer, of the potential destruction AgriCorp's plans could bring. "Mr. Caldwell," Jack said slowly, "I appreciate your offer, but this isn't about money. It's about preserving something precious, something that can't be bought or sold." "My answer is no," Caldwell's face hardened. "You're making a mistake, Thompson. We have resources you can't imagine. This fight will destroy you, your farm, maybe even this town." Jack stood, his voice steady. "Maybe, but it's a fight worth having. Now, I think it's time for you to leave." As Caldwell's car disappeared down the driveway, Sarah came out onto the porch. "Was that who I think it was?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. Jack nodded, pulling her close. "It was. They're getting desperate, Sarah, which means we might just have a chance." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jack felt a mixture of fear and hope. The battle for Heartland's soul was reaching its climax. The days ahead would test them all in ways they couldn't imagine. But looking out over the land he loved, with Sarah by his side and the strength of his community behind him, Jack Thompson felt ready to face whatever came next. The spirit of Heartland, resilient, unbreakable, rooted in the very soil beneath their feet, would carry them through. As news of Caldwell's visit spread through Heartland, it galvanized the community in a way nothing else had. The realization that AgriCorp was feeling the pressure of their campaign ignited a new fire in the town's collective spirit. Jack found himself at the center of a whirlwind of activity, coordinating efforts on multiple fronts while trying to manage his own health concerns. One morning, as Jack was reviewing the latest updates from their legal team, Sarah burst into the study, her face flushed with excitement. "Jack, you need to see this," she said, thrusting a tablet into his hands. On the screen was a national news website featuring a prominent headline, "David versus Goliath. Small town takes on agricultural giant." The article, penned by a respected environmental journalist, detailed Heartland's struggle against agriculture, painting a vivid picture of a community fighting for its very soul. "Emily's work," Jack breathed, a smile spreading across his face. "She did it. She got our story out there." The article was just the beginning. Over the next few days, Heartland found itself in the national spotlight. Reporters descended on the town, eager to capture the human stories behind the headline. Jack and Sarah found themselves giving interviews, their weathered faces becoming the symbol of Heartland's resistance. The increased attention brought both opportunities and challenges. On one hand, it put additional pressure on AgriCorp and the bank, forcing them to respond publicly to the allegations of collusion and environmental disregard. On the other, it meant that every move the Save Heartland campaign made was now under scrutiny. In the midst of the media frenzy, Jack received an unexpected call. It was from Senator Eleanor Hayes, a powerful voice in state politics known for her advocacy for rural communities. "Mr. Thompson," the senator's voice crackled over the line, "I've been following your story with great interest. I'd like to visit Heartland, see the situation for myself. Would you be willing to show me around?" Jack felt a surge of hope. Senator Hayes' support could be a game changer. "We'd be honored, Senator," he replied, his mind already racing with plans. The day of the senator's visit dawned clear and bright. Jack, despite Sarah's concerned looks, had been up since before dawn, ensuring everything was in order. As he stood waiting by the old grain elevator, now a symbol of Heartland's resilience, he felt the familiar tightness in his chest that had been plaguing him lately. He took a deep breath, pushing the discomfort aside. There was too much at stake to falter now. Senator Hayes arrived with minimal fanfare, her no-nonsense demeanor a refreshing change from the slick corporate representatives they'd been dealing with. Jack led her on a tour of the town and surrounding farmland, introducing her to community members and explaining their vision for the cooperative. As they stood atop a hill overlooking the vast expanse of farmland, the senator turned to Jack, her eyes sharp. "You've built something remarkable here, Mr. Thompson. Not just a business plan, but a movement. Tell me, what do you need to make this work?" Jack felt the weight of the moment. He thought of all they'd been through, all that was at stake. "Time, Senator," he said finally. "We need time to get our cooperative fully operational, to prove that our model can work. And we need protection, legal safeguards to prevent corporations from exploiting our natural resources." The senator nodded thoughtfully. "I can't make any promises, Mr. Thompson, but I'll do what I can. Your fight here in Heartland, it's emblematic of a larger struggle happening across rural America. It's time someone took a stand, As word of the senator's support spread, it injected new energy into the campaign, but it also seemed to heighten the tension in town. Jack began to notice unfamiliar faces watching him as he went about his business, and there were whispers of pressure being applied to some of the campaign's supporters. One evening, as Jack was locking up the cooperative's office, he felt a presence behind him. Turning, he found himself face to face with two men he didn't recognize, their expressions far from friendly. "Mr. Thompson," one of them said, his voice low and menacing, "we've got a message for you. Back off. This little campaign of yours is causing a lot of trouble for some very powerful people. It would be a shame if something were to happen to that nice farm of yours." Jack felt a chill run down his spine, but he stood his ground. "I don't respond well to threats," he said evenly, "and neither does this town. You can tell your bosses that Heartland isn't for sale." As the men skulked away, Jack leaned against the wall, his heart racing. The confrontation had shaken him more than he cared to admit. It was one thing to face corporate lawyers and PR spin. Outright intimidation was another matter entirely. When he arrived home, Sarah took one look at his face and knew something was wrong. As Jack recounted the encounter, he could see the fear in her eyes, mirroring his own. Maybe we should consider backing down," Sarah said hesitantly. "Jack, I'm worried. Your health, these threats. Is it worth risking everything?" Jack took her hands in his, feeling the familiar calluses, the strength that had supported him through so many challenges. "Sarah, do you remember what my father used to say? This land is our legacy, not just ours to use, but ours to protect for the future. If we back down now, what kind of legacy are we leaving for our children, for our community?" Sarah nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "You're right. Of course, you're right. But promise me you'll be careful. We can't win this if we lose you." The next day, Jack called an emergency meeting of the campaign's core team. As he shared the details of the threat, he could see the shock and anger on their faces. Emily was the first to speak up. "This is serious, Jack. We need to document everything, get it on record, and we should consider going public with this. If they're resorting to intimidation, it means we're getting to them." Lisa nodded in agreement. "I'll file a police report, and I think we should consider private security, at least for the key members of the campaign." As they discussed their options, Jack felt a mix of emotions: fear for the safety of his family and friends, anger at the lengths their opponents were willing to go to, but also a deep sense of pride in the unwavering commitment of his team. The threat, once made public, had an unexpected effect on the community. Instead of cowing people into submission, it seemed to strengthen their resolve. Volunteers began patrolling the streets at night, watching out for any suspicious activity. Farmers opened their barns and silos to store important documents and equipment, creating a distributed network that would be hard to target. In the midst of this heightened tension, Jack received news that both elated and terrified him. Lisa, their lawyer, called with an update on their legal challenge. "Jack, we've got a breakthrough," she said, her voice brimming with excitement. "A whistleblower from within AgriCorp has come forward. They're willing to testify about the company's environmental violations and their collusion with the bank. This could be the key to our entire case." Jack felt a surge of hope, quickly followed by a wave of anxiety. "That's incredible news, Lisa, but it also means AgriCorp will be desperate. We need to move fast." As he hung up, Jack felt the familiar tightness in his chest intensify. The stress of the past weeks, the constant pressure, the late nights and early mornings, it was all taking its toll. But he pushed the discomfort aside. They were so close now. He couldn't falter, not when the finish line was finally in sight. That night, as Jack lay in bed, sleep eluding him, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. From that first letter threatening foreclosure to the national movement they'd sparked, it had been a roller coaster of emotions and challenges. Sarah stirred beside him, sensing his restlessness. "What are you thinking about?" she murmured sleepily. Jack turned to her, drinking in the familiar contours of her face, softened by moonlight streaming through the window. "About how far we've come," he said softly, "and how far we still have to go." Sarah propped herself up on one elbow, fully awake now. "We'll make it, Jack. Together. This town, This land, it's in our blood. We won't let it go without a fight." As Jack finally drifted off to sleep, his dreams were filled with images of golden wheat fields stretching to the horizon, of community barn raisings, of generations of farmers standing tall against adversity. In his sleep, a small smile played across his face. The final battle for Heartland's soul was approaching, and Jack Thompson, despite the threats, despite his health concerns, despite the enormous odds stacked against him, felt ready to face it head-on. The dawn broke over Heartland with a sense of anticipation hanging in the air. Today was the day of the injunction hearing, a pivotal moment in their legal battle against Agricorp and the bank. As Jack knotted his tie, a rare concession to formality, he could feel the weight of the entire community's hopes resting on his shoulders. Sarah appeared in the doorway, her face a mixture of pride and concern. "You ready for this?" she asked softly. Jack nodded, meeting her eyes in the mirror. "As ready as I'll ever be. This is our chance, Sarah, to make them listen, to make them understand what's really at stake here." The drive to the courthouse in the nearby city was quiet, each lost in their own thoughts. As they approached, Jack was stunned to see the crowd gathered outside. It seemed half of Heartland had made the journey, joined by supporters from neighboring towns and even some faces he didn't recognize. People who had heard their story and come to stand with. Lisa met them at the courthouse steps, her usually calm demeanor tinged with excitement. "Our whistleblower is here," she whispered as they climbed the stairs. "And Jack, you won't believe who it is." As they entered the courtroom, Jack's eyes widened in shock. There, sitting with Lisa's legal team, was Mike Donovan. Their eyes met, and Mike gave a small nod, his face set with determination. The proceedings began, a flurry of legal jargon and procedural formalities that Jack struggled to follow. But as Mike took the stand, the courtroom fell into a hushed silence. Mike's testimony was damning. He laid out in meticulous detail the collusion between the bank and Agricorp, the deliberate targeting of small farms, the environmental corners cut in pursuit of profit. As he spoke, Jack could see the judge's expression shifting from skepticism to concern. When it was Jack's turn to testify, he felt a moment of panic. He was a farmer, not a public speaker. But as he took the stand and looked out over the courtroom, seeing the faces of his friends and neighbors, he felt a calm settle over him. "Your Honor," he began, his voice steady, "I'm not here to talk about legal technicalities or corporate strategies. I'm here to talk about legacy, about the responsibility we have to the land and to each other." As Jack spoke, he painted a vivid picture of Heartland, not just as it was, but as it could be. He talked about the cooperative they were building, about sustainable farming practices that could revitalize the soil and the community. He spoke of generations past and generations to come, of the delicate balance between progress and preservation. "What Agricorp is proposing isn't progress," he concluded, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "It's exploitation. They see our land as a resource to be drained and discarded. We see it as a legacy to be nurtured and passed on. Your Honor, we're not asking for charity or special treatment. We're asking for the chance to prove that there's a better way, a way that respects the land, the community, and the future." As Jack stepped down, he caught Sarah's eye. She was beaming at him, tears glistening in her eyes. He had done all he could. Now, it was up to the judge. The wait for the judge's decision was agonizing. As they stood outside the courthouse, surrounded by supporters, Jack felt the strain of the past months catching up with him. His chest tightened, a dull ache spreading through his left arm. He took a deep breath, trying to will away the discomfort. Sarah noticed immediately. "Jack, what's wrong?" Her voice was sharp with concern. Before he could answer, a ripple of excitement went through the crowd. The judge was ready to announce her decision. Back in the courtroom, Jack sat ramrod straight, his discomfort forgotten in the tension of the moment. The judge's voice seemed to echo in the hushed room. "After careful consideration of the evidence presented, I am granting the injunction against Agricorp and the associated financial institutions. Their activities in Heartland are to cease immediately pending a full investigation into the allegations of environmental violations and illegal business practices." A collective gasp went up from the Heartland contingent, quickly stifled in the formal setting of the courtroom. Jack felt lightheaded, the judge's words ringing in his ears. They had done it. They had won the first battle. As they exited the courthouse, they were met with a wall of sound. Cheers, applause, and the excited chatter of supporters and media. Jack found himself swept up in a sea of handshakes and backslaps, his name being called from all directions. Amidst the chaos, he spotted Robert Caldwell slipping away, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Their eyes met for a moment, and Jack saw something there that chilled him. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the impromptu celebration continued, Jack felt the discomfort in his chest return with a vengeance. The world seemed to tilt sideways, voices fading into a distant buzz. He reached out, trying to find Sarah, but his vision was blurring. "Jack, Jack." Sarah's voice seemed to come from far away. He tried to respond, but no words came. The last thing he saw was Sarah's terrified face as the world went black. Jack awoke to the steady beep of hospital monitors and the antiseptic smell of a cardiac care unit. Sarah was by his side in an instant, her face etched with worry and relief. "What happened?" he croaked, his throat dry. "You had a heart attack, Jack," Sarah said softly, squeezing his hand. The doctor said it was a close call. If we hadn't been right there at the courthouse, the implications hung in the air between them. Jack closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his own mortality pressing down on him. They had won the injunction, but at what cost? Over the next few days, as Jack began his recovery, a steady stream of visitors kept him updated on the events unfolding in Heartland. The injunction had bought them time, but AgriCorp wasn't going down without a fight. They had launched a massive PR campaign, portraying themselves as the victims of small-town obstruction and fear of progress. Emily was working tirelessly to counter their narrative, leveraging the national attention they had garnered to tell Heartland's story. Hank and the others were pushing forward with the cooperative, determined to prove that their model could work. As Jack listened to their reports, he felt a mix of pride and frustration. They were doing incredible work, but he yearned to be out there with them, leading the charge. On the third day of his hospital stay, he received an unexpected visitor. Senator Hayes strode into his room, her presence filling the small space. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice warm but businesslike. "I'm glad to see you're on the mend. We need you back in the fight." Jack struggled to sit up straighter. "Senator, I don't know how much fight I have left in me," he admitted, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. The senator's gaze softened. "Jack, what you and Heartland have accomplished is remarkable. You've sparked a movement that's spreading across the country. Small towns and farmers are standing up, demanding a say in their futures. But the battle is far from over." She leaned in, her voice low and urgent. "AgriCorp and their allies are pushing for legislation that would make it nearly impossible for communities to challenge corporate land acquisitions. We need Heartland's voice now more than ever." Jack felt a familiar fire ignite in his chest, different from the pain of his heart attack, but no less intense. "What can we do?" he asked. The senator smiled, a glint of approval in her eyes. "Get well, first and foremost. And then, I want you to come to the state capitol. Testify before the Agricultural Committee. Tell your story, Jack. Make them understand what's really at stake." As the senator left, Jack turned to Sarah, seeing the mixture of pride and fear in her eyes. "I have to do this," he said softly. Sarah nodded, squeezing his hand. "I know. Just promise me you'll take it easy. We've come too far to lose you now." In the days that followed, as Jack slowly regained his strength, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. From that first threatening letter to the courtroom victory, it had been a roller coaster of challenges and triumphs. But as he looked out the hospital window at the distant fields of Heartland, he realized that this was more than just a fight for their farms or their way of life. It was a battle for the soul of rural America itself, a chance to prove that progress didn't have to come at the cost of community, that there was value in the old ways even as they embraced the new. As he drifted off to sleep that night, Jack's dreams were filled with images of golden wheat fields stretching to the horizon, of barn raisings and harvest festivals, of generations of farmers standing tall against adversity. And in his sleep, A small smile played across his face. The fight for Heartland's soul was far from over. But Jack Thompson, despite his weakened heart, felt his spirit stronger than ever. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he was ready to face them. For his family, for his community, and for the future of the land he loved so dearly. As Jack Thompson stood at the podium in the state capitol, the weight of Heartland's future resting on his shoulders, he took a moment to survey the room. The agricultural committee members sat before him, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. In the gallery behind them, he could see familiar faces from home: Sarah, Emily, Hank, and many others who had made the journey to support him. And there, in the back, stood Senator Hayes, her presence a silent reminder of the broader implications of their fight. Jack took a deep breath, feeling the familiar tightness in his chest, a constant reminder of his recent health scare. But as he began to speak, his voice grew stronger with each word. "Distinguished committee members," he began, "I stand before you not just as a farmer fighting for his land, but as a voice for countless rural communities across our state and nation. The issue we face in Heartland is not unique. It's a story playing out in small towns everywhere. The story of corporate interests threatening to erase generations of history, tradition, and sustainable living." As Jack spoke, he painted a vivid picture of Heartland, not just as it was, but as it could be. He talked about the cooperative they were building, about innovative farming practices that could revitalize both the soil and the community. He spoke of the delicate balance between progress and preservation, and the responsibility they held to future generations. "What companies like AgriCorp offer isn't true progress," he continued, his voice ringing out clear and strong. "It's a short-term gain that comes at an immeasurable long-term cost. They see our land as a resource to be exploited and discarded. We see it as a legacy to be nurtured and passed on." Jack could see his words were having an impact. Some committee members leaned forward, engaged. Others shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing uncomfortable truths in his words. "We're not asking for handouts or special treatment," Jack concluded. "We're asking for the chance to prove that there's a better way. A way that respects the land, honors our heritage, and builds a sustainable future for rural America. The legislation before you would strip communities of their right to have a say in their own futures. I urge you to reject it and instead work with us to find solutions that benefit all, not just powerful corporations." As Jack stepped back from the podium, the room erupted in applause, not just from the Heartland contingent, but from many of the committee members as well. He caught Sarah's eye in the crowd, saw the pride shining there, and felt a surge of hope. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Jack's testimony had struck a chord, not just with the committee, but with the public. Media requests poured in, and soon Heartland's story was being told on national news broadcasts and in major newspapers. But with increased attention came increased pressure. AgriCorp and its allies launched an aggressive counter-campaign, portraying Heartland as backward-thinking obstructionists, standing in the way of progress and job creation. Through it all, the community stood strong. The cooperative continued to grow, with more farmers joining every day. Emily's media savvy helped them control their narrative, countering AgriCorp's spin with authentic stories of rural resilience and innovation. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, the tide began to turn. The proposed legislation was tabled, with several key lawmakers citing Jack's testimony as a wake-up call. More importantly, other communities began to reach out, inspired by Heartland's stand. A network of rural cooperatives started to form, sharing resources and knowledge. It was a crisp autumn day when Jack received the call they'd all been waiting for. Senator Hayes' voice crackled over the line, excitement evident even through the static. "We did it, Jack," she said. "The committee just voted. The bill is dead, and they're recommending a full investigation into AgriCorp's practices. It's not over, but it's a huge victory." As Jack shared the news with Sarah and then with the rest of the community, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. They had done it. They had stood up to seemingly insurmountable odds and emerged victorious. The celebration that erupted in Heartland that evening was unlike anything Jack had ever seen. The town square was filled with people, music played, and laughter rang out under the stars. As Jack stood on the makeshift stage, looking out over the sea of joyful faces, he felt a profound sense of gratitude and accomplishment. This victory, he called out, his voice carrying over the crowd, belongs to all of us. To every farmer who refused to give up, to every volunteer who put in countless hours, to every supporter who stood with us. But our work isn't done. This is just the beginning. In the months that followed, Heartland underwent a transformation. The cooperative flourished, attracting attention from agricultural experts and sustainable farming advocates from around the country. The old grain elevator, once a symbol of their struggle, became a hub of innovation, hosting workshops and seminars on regenerative agriculture techniques. Jack, taking his doctor's warnings to heart, stepped back from the day-to-day operations, focusing instead on mentoring the next generation of farmers. He found joy in passing on his knowledge, in seeing young people fall in love with the land the way he had so many years ago. One warm spring evening, as Jack and Sarah sat on their porch watching the sun set over their fields, a familiar car pulled up the driveway. To their surprise, Robert Caldwell stepped out, looking decidedly less polished than in their previous encounters. "Mr. Thompson," Caldwell called out, approaching cautiously. "I was hoping we could talk." Jack nodded, gesturing to an empty chair. Caldwell sat, looking uncomfortable. "I'll be direct," Caldwell began. "Agricorp is changing direction. The board has decided to invest in sustainable agriculture initiatives, and we'd like your help." Jack raised an eyebrow, skepticism evident in his expression. Caldwell continued, "What you've built here in Heartland, it's remarkable. We were wrong to try to fight it. Now, we want to learn from it, to be part of it, if you'll have us." Jack was silent for a long moment, considering the implications of Caldwell's words. Finally, he spoke. "It won't be easy. There's a lot of mistrust to overcome." Caldwell nodded. "I understand, but we're willing to put in the work to prove ourselves." As Caldwell left, promising to return with a more detailed proposal, Jack turned to Sarah. "What do you think?" he asked. Sarah smiled, a mix of emotions playing across her face. "I think this is what you've been fighting for all along. Not just to save Heartland, but to change the way people think about farming, about community, about the future." Jack nodded, feeling a sense of completion wash over him. They had not just saved their farm or their town. They had sparked a movement, a reimagining of what rural life could be in the modern world. In the years that followed, Heartland became a model for rural revitalization. The cooperative expanded, partnering with universities for research and with tech companies to implement cutting-edge sustainable farming practices. Young people who had once fled to cities for opportunities now returned, drawn by the chance to be part of something meaningful. And through it all, at the heart of Heartland, stood the Thompson farm. On warm evenings, Jack and Sarah could often be found on their porch, watching the sun set over fields that had been in their family for generations. But now, those fields were part of something bigger, a testament to the power of community, perseverance, and the enduring spirit of the land. As twilight deepened into night, Jack reached for Sarah's hand, feeling the familiar calluses, the strength that had supported him through every challenge. "We did it," he said softly, his voice filled with wonder and gratitude. Sarah squeezed his hand in return. "We did," she agreed. "And more importantly, we showed them all what Heartland is really made of." As the stars began to twinkle overhead, Jack Thompson looked out over the land he loved, the community he had fought for, and felt a deep sense of peace. The fight for Heartland's soul was over, and they had emerged not just victorious, but transformed. In saving their home, they had charted a new course for rural America, one of hope, innovation, and unwavering commitment to the land and to each other. The legacy of Heartland, Jack realized, was no longer just about preserving the past. It was about building a future where the values of community and stewardship could coexist with progress and innovation. And as he sat there, hand in hand with Sarah, listening to the night sounds of the farm, Jack knew that this legacy would endure, a beacon of hope for generations to come. If you enjoyed this story, We'd love for you to support us by leaving a like and subscribing to our Slices of Life channel. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Which city are you talking about? It's very rewarding for us to provide our followers with an enjoyable moment. We appreciate the unconditional support you show us in every story. Blessings!